Mazzy Star play it through, and if you know anything about this band, they played it in a way that was entirely hushed. They were covered in shadows on stage. You couldn't see the singer on the stage. You could hardly see the guitarist. Couldn't really see anyone. And at the very end, the audience kind of gave this round of applause. And in a very famous moment, the lead singer, Hope Sandoval, leans into the microphone and essentially chastises the audience. She says, "Why were you clapping? You weren't even listening."
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Before we get into this episode and introduce this episode's guest, just want to let you know listeners and viewers can get 15% off classic rock merchandise at oldglory.com with the code Booked on Rock. The link's in the show notes or at bookedonrock.com under my deals. Anthony Gomez III. He's the author of Mazzy Star's So Tonight That I Might See, part of Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 1/3 series. Anthony, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Eric.
Always look forward to having authors of books as part of this series. It's such a great series of books. I'm assuming you are quite honored to be part of this 33 1/3 series.
Yeah, it's I don't know if you want to hear the full story, but the initial idea for this book, let me just say, I think I came up with it probably 10 years ago now. I realized 2016. I had picked up one of which I think is still one of the coolest volumes in the series. One written by Alex Niven on Oasis, Definitely Maybe, who somehow convinces you that Oasis are the great socialist band of the 90s. I don't know if that argument has any sway, but I read it back then and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to write my own. I got to write something in this series. And it's taken me a while to get there, but yeah, I'm super proud, super excited to be part of it.
Well, from what I read, you were a little timid. In fact, too timid to take the plunge and submit a proposal during the annual open call for 33 1/3. So you do thank your wife, Shay. She helped to push you out of that comfort zone and just think about this book, let alone getting started on it. So I'm curious as to what was holding you back and what was it that your wife was able to do or say to finally get you to the place where you're ready to take that plunge?
I think like a lot of people who want to write for this series or want to write about music at all, right? You get this question, which if you're not familiar with the series, 33 1/3 is one writer writing about one album they deem is significant. And you think about the kind of music you want to write about, you think about the album, especially you want to write about, and you kind of come up with a few different options, a few different ideas. And the first time I thought about what I want to write about, I thought about Mazzy Star back in 2016. But I thought about their first album, She Hangs Brightly, which was the one I was kind of more honestly into, or the one I was more fascinated by. But I was also thinking about writing on Morrissey and his album, You Are the Quarry from 2004, which is this kind of strange album in which he's on one hand belittling England and the UK, but on the other hand talking about Mexican Americans in LA with a song like First of the Gang to Die. And I was also thinking about My Chemical Romance and this weird Mexican fandom they had. And I just, I was drawn to those ideas, but also kind of bored by them. I'd seen other people do things. And I kept coming back to Mazzy Star over the years, but being like, do I really want to write about something that's so personal to me that I care so much about? And finally, my wife said, just do it. Get the proposal out there and even see if they'll respond. I'm one of the lucky ones to have submitted a proposal one time and have had it work out. But it was, like I said, a long journey to get there. And I'm glad I chose Mazzy Star.
Well, let's get into the book. You write about a night in October of 1994 when the band's singer, Hope Sandoval, reacts to the audience clapping, but not the way that most would expect. Take us inside that night at the Mint. What was happening in that room when that moment unfolded?
The Mint is this intimate blues venue in LA that's actually still around. And they kind of give a preview in full of So Tonight That I Might See, their second album. And Mazzy Star play it through. And if you know anything about this band, they played it in a way that was entirely hushed. They were covered in shadows on stage. You couldn't see the singer on the stage. You could hardly see the guitarist. Couldn't really see anyone. And at the very end, the audience kind of gave this round of applause. And in a very famous moment, the lead singer, Hope Sandoval, leans into the microphone and essentially chastises the audience. She says, "Why were you clapping? You weren't even listening." And I talk about this moment as, on one hand, you could read into it and be like, "Oh my God, this is the most annoying kind of self-righteous, pretentious kind of group there is." But on the other hand, I think if you know anything about Mazzy Star, or you're fascinated by this want for silence, intimacy, to listen to music on a kind of intimate level, on a personal level, it really resonates with the fan base. And I talk about it as kind of an understanding that if you are a fan, it feels like a kind of ticket of admission that you want to actually be on Hope Sandoval's side when she chastises the crowd. But maybe that's just me.
Well, Hope and David Roback, who they formed the band together, introverts. Sadly, David is no longer with us. Introverts, right? I mean,
Mhm.
even Hope says that in an interview. I did see that on YouTube.
Yeah, what's one of the fun parts about this book, and one of the fun parts about being a Mazzy Star fan, is nowadays you're kind of almost spoiled. You could go online, you could go on YouTube and watch their few live performances they have. You could watch the interviews they have. But what's super unusual for a band this late in the game from the 1990s is you could pretty much exhaust all the material there is in an afternoon. If even that, maybe several hours, and you come back to this group, and yeah, they're constantly silent. They were called an interviewer's worst nightmare. They hardly like to talk. They hardly like to respond to anything. When journalists often ask these questions, one word could suffice, if any word was even given. And if you really follow their career and follow their interviews, it's a nightmare of trying to understand what they're about, because sometimes they didn't want to speak. Sometimes when they did speak, they contradicted each other. Sometimes they contradicted past interviews. Sometimes they contradicted things that were known to be facts. And so this is introverts galore. This is introverts um, forced into a spotlight, at least in this album, and at least in this particular moment. But yeah, introvert is almost too kind of a word, or too
Right.
too small of a word for them.
Right. You say silence is central to Mazzy Star's mythology. Is their legacy stronger because they withheld so much?
Yeah, I view Hope Sandoval in particular, and I view the band as part of this, as part of that legacy of the kind of reluctant genius, or the kind of quiet, introverted genius. I think of Mazzy Star, I think of Hope Sandoval, like the authors Donna Tartt or Elena Ferrante, if you know them, people who kind of don't crave the public eye, who don't let their image be circulated beyond what they want. I think about them like D'Angelo, someone who's willing to retreat even when they have all this kind of momentum or potential momentum behind them. And what shyness, as I say, shyness and silence is allowing this group to do, or what it's allowed them to do, is become a kind of totem for all sorts of people's thoughts and desires. People want to kind of project their fantasies onto the band. People, unfortunately, want to project certain fantasies onto the lead singer, which, of course, happens to many a front woman in bands. People want to sexualize it. They want to kind of see this as a kind of dream play out, but it's also enabled them to kind of withstand scrutiny, able to withstand political change. And it's also, I think, and this is an intangible factor, it's made David Roback and Hope Sandoval just seem cool. Like they just seem so above it all. They seem above the kind of game of hustling for your audience, hustling for the kind of attention of a record company, just so you could have a few more bucks, or just so you could get that other record out there, just so you could play a bigger stadium. And I think in the age of social media, I think in the age of the internet, that just seems so unusual to us. But they've held on to their silence, and they managed to do it for a very long time, which I think is something most people could not do.
And I think that would be much more appreciated, at least in the 90s, because you did have bands like Pearl Jam, Eddie Vedder, the reluctant rock star. He wasn't the only one. I mean, Kurt Cobain, guys like that. So I think it was probably a good time for them to surface, right? Do you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think along that line, and I talk about this, I mean, their ability to be silent for so long is certainly a privilege. They came of age and they kind of appeared in the right time, the 1990s, when alternative music can actually make a splash, when a one huge hit single could actually not only sustain your career, but give you money to live off of. because our lead singer, Hope Sandoval, is not a wealthy person. She's coming from this working class background and she's kind of relying on record sales, relying on the kind of limited interactions in the industry to also keep her afloat. And there is a kind of risk that that's all going to go away. But the 90s has kind of enabled that. The 90s has also kind of enabled the refusal to sell out as a kind of paradoxical way of making your kind of fortune. And so, yeah, there's the kind of Pearl Jam, there's their Nirvana, but there's also all of a sudden the emergence of women doing this too. A woman being able to kind of frame their own kind of music scene.
You bring in Olvera Street, the historic Mexican marketplace in downtown LA, Mexican iconography and Chicano culture. Why was it important to place those influences near the center of this story?
One of the things that drew me to write the book is, I've always talked about Mazzy Star, I was always playing it, and I thought it was always understood that our lead singer was a Chicana woman. And I always thought it was understood that she was someone who just kind of embraced a kind of LA that was never really shown in the movies. In LA, that's the East Side, the Mexicano side. And when I would talk to people and they wouldn't know that, one, it kind of surprised me. But two, I didn't think that Hope Sandoval necessarily owed it to talk about it. I didn't think this was a kind of simple story of, oh my, this is someone's identity influencing the music per se. But I did think that element was kind of there. And I think if you're going to talk about Mazzy Star and you're going to talk about them as a band that's interested in both dark and the light, and the way the light can kind of permeate through the darkness of the seedy elements of the city, that is LA, you had to talk about where she was from. And you had to talk about the kind of one extreme violence that happened around her in East LA. And you had to talk about also the kind of Mexican iconography that was everywhere, especially in the 80s and 90s. And you had to talk about Alvera Street, which is kind of a communal center, a place where you could go at all times of the year to buy kind of traditional Mexican items, where you could see traditional Mexican music be played by musicians, where you could hear it all times of the year, where you kind of go through a market that feels like it could be in the middle of Mexico City or Baja California. And it seems so obvious that there were kind of scenes and kind of feelings that permeate the music that could only be felt in that side of Los Angeles. And a side of LA, I think people don't really think about unless you're from there. Otherwise, you're just crossing it over on the freeway.
The album opens with that big hit, Fade Into You. That's the first track, written by Hope and David Roback. You suggest that Sandoval is singing both to the listener and to Roback. How did that change the way you heard the song?
I've always heard it, I think, because of the way it's used in film and TV. It's always used, I call it as a cheat code for romance and nostalgia. It's almost always played in kind of youthful moments or when people are looking back or people are kind of wistful for something that may or may not happen. And I thought that's a great interpretation. And I don't think there's any wrong interpretations. But I thought it was kind of interesting how two introverts could kind of be pushed into a spotlight on this song, and how two introverts on this song, especially in the music video, seem constantly kind of interacting with each other. And it seemed that maybe there's a kind of other way of thinking about romance, not just for like the opposite sex, not just in the kind of traditional romantic way we think of, but as friends, as two people who actually are able to kind of be comfortable with each other. I don't think there's anything better than finding someone that you're able to be in a state of comfortable silence with, that you don't always have to kind of talk. You don't always have to kind of find something to kind of conversate about. But here are two people who are willing to kind of expose themselves in a way that they didn't really have in other people before, in a way that they hardly even had in other bands, because these are people who came from other musical groups first. And yet, what does it mean to also fade into someone that you really care about as a friend? And I thought maybe that was another kind of interesting potential way of opening the song up to a new dimension of listeners, or to at least a new kind of way of thinking.
And there are two videos, right?
Yeah.
Two videos were made. There's one, the Kevin Kerslake version. That was the second one made.
Yeah.
That was a marketing decision by the label.
It's believed to pretty much be a marketing decision. If you look at the first video that they did for Fade Into You, which you could look on YouTube, it's called the international version now. But the original cut of Fade Into You was a black and white music video. And it had a couple of scenes of the band, but they were kind of covered in shadows. And when it kind of zoomed away from them, it moved into a building that's completely obfuscated. You can't quite tell what's going on. It hardly seems like the thing that would have racked up viewers on MTV back in the 90s. It's kind of almost an uninteresting piece of like visual art, something you could see at a museum and be like, huh, I wonder what that's about. But instead, we got a kind of video that's now more famous, which features the band, David Roback and Hope Sandoval in particular, out in the Southern California desert, not too far from the kind of Joshua Tree area. And in the second video, which was kind of a forced decision by Capitol Records, in a kind of terms of one critic, a kind of cynical decision to kind of push our lead woman to the front and center to give the viewer something they thought was more interesting to look at than the black and white fuzziness of that first video. And in the second video, Mazzy Star bring on a friend, someone that they've worked with before to help them kind of create a visual image they want. And that is them kind of out in the desert, in which we kind of see them in these kind of oft repeated, oft reposted images online now. But it's a kind of interesting kind of, and one of the few times that they're ever kind of forced to do this.
What do you think that video reveals about the band, maybe that the song alone does?
I think one of the things is one, it goes back to that kind of Mexican iconography, the desert, the kind of almost surrealist kind of landscapes that they're playing with, the kind of ways the kind of modern world is kind of crashing on the natural world, is constantly happening. But also there's these weird, interesting, slowed down scenes of David Roback and Hope Sandoval really kind of finding comfort in each other. I think David Roback is literally driving Hope Sandoval across the desert. At times, Hope Sandoval's looking at him, not, I don't think necessarily romantically, um, but longingly, happily. And there's a kind of comfort of them that I think the song doesn't necessarily evoke on its own. But by seeing them and hearing them kind of paired with that song, we see that kind of friendship and we see how close these people really are as a unit.
The video, the song itself, you put those together, you got a big hit, reached number 3 on the US Billboard Modern Rock Track chart in 1984, peaked at number 44 on Billboard's Hot 100. In 2025, the song eclipsed 1 billion plays on Spotify. 1 billion. Do you think the band ever wanted success on that level?
I don't think they ever would have predicted it. I hardly think they wanted it. I think one of the most amazing stories, if you believe it, is Fade Into You was almost an afterthought. They claim they wrote it in an afternoon where they pretty much were walking around Santa Monica, Los Angeles. They go back to the studio in LA and they toss off this song called Fade Into You. And it ends up being, of course, the lead single. It's an amazing kind of coincidence. And it's the most accessible track on the album. It's the most radio friendly track on the album. But it's also, in the words of David Roback, just a great song. I think anyone who listens to it, it doesn't matter the age, finds something that appeals to them with it. I don't think it's a coincidence it's used all the time because it just evokes so much emotion. But whether they would have predicted it and whether they wanted it, probably not on both fronts.
But it has stood up so well over
Yeah.
the years. If somebody listens to it for the first time today, it's of the times right now. It doesn't sound like necessarily from a particular era, which is what makes it such a great song. Now, the second track, Bells Ring, you say it's an announcement of emotional confidence. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, well, I think whereas Fade Into You is read as the kind of romantic song, or in my case, the kind of song about friendship, Ring becomes a kind of emotional announcement of Hope Sandoval's kind of comfortable voice. It becomes her own kind of poetry, becomes her own kind of lyrics, um, up front and center. Bells Ring, literally the kind of announcement of what this kind of album is feeding into, of equal parts dark and light, of wanting to hear things, of wanting to notice things, and seeing the kind of paradoxical ways humans have emotions, which of course unfolds across the album. And it's a kind of beautiful song. It's, I think, one of the most underrated songs of the album. They try to kind of put it out there, the record company, and it's just not absorbed the same way. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is they package older songs for some reason with Fade Into You. So everybody's naturally going from Fade Into You to the B side. from their earlier album. But Bells Ring, I think, is kind of the one of the forgotten momentous tracks in that sequence in the second album.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Anthony Gomez III, he's the author of Mazzy Star's So Tonight That I Might See. It's part of Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 1/3 series. You present the Doors and the band Love as especially important to David Roback. You write that on Mary of Silence, Roback pulls a Jim Morrison. For listeners who might not immediately hear it, where does that Doors influence show up most clearly in this song?
Yeah, Mary of Silence, I call like a Stephen King Carey story. It feels like a woman is kind of hauntingly moving through, eager for revenge. I think there's a great lyric about this character, Mary, literally devouring hearts. And I talk about how the guitar on it, which is kind of this heavy, frequent, almost slowly drawn out strum and strum and strum, just echoes so much of what Jim Morrison and the Doors were doing on things like LA Woman. This kind of willingness to think about the darkness of LA again, and this willingness to think about the seediness and to bring it to the surface. I think David Roback on that song in particular, and a few others, but on Mary of Silence in particular, it makes his guitar sound so much like Jim Morrison's kind of boorish, drunken singing. The way it sounds like Jim Morrison's emerging from a bar, David Roback's guitar sounds like it's coming out of a honky tonk, following and soundtracking that kind of, you know, movement out.
Yeah, and I think you answered part of the question I was going to ask is, who is Mary? Do you see her as a literal character or more of a psychological presence throughout the song?
Yeah, it's such a funny thing is one of the things I think people don't appreciate about So Tonight that I might see is how much of it is about these kind of especially female characters just taking back things, taking revenge or taking ownership of something. If you want to talk about a kind of Kurt Cobain feeling, it's right there. Kurt Cobain does this all the time, and like Frances Farmer wants her revenge. But Mary in particular is, yeah, she's devouring all those people who wronged her. She's willing to eat the hearts of those who broke her romantic spirit. She's willing to kind of take revenge on the men, the women, and those who don't understand her. But also, she's a silent person. She wants to be an introvert. She wants to kind of stay quiet. And a world wants to make her noisy, make her talk. And she kind of says no as a character in that story.
There's the cover of the Love song, Five String Serenade. And you say David stays close to singer Arthur Lee's original feel, but Hope transforms it. What changes the most in her version?
Arthur Lee's version is a curiosity to me. There's something kind of, I can't quite fully pinpoint it down, and I've always struggled with this. There's something paradoxical about Arthur Lee's voice. For as sweet sounding as it is, as kind as it is, there seems to be this underpinning of a darkness. Five String Serenade, in my estimation, the way he records it, feels kind of heartbroken. It feels kind of disjointed. It feels kind of off in a way, whereas Hope Sandoval makes it such an ode of devotion. There is a kind of sadness that underpins it, but all of a sudden it feels much more lighthearted, and it feels like a kind of lightness, and that ends the second or the first half of the record.
And you suggest Blue Light, the next track, which leads off side two, may reflect the loss of a bandmate. Who was that bandmate, and what led you to make that connection?
Blue Light is a curiosity in the album in that it could be kind of seen a couple of ways. On one hand, I think about it as Hope Sandoval kind of reflecting on one of her earlier bands, Going Home, which she formed with Sylvia Gomez, one of her high school friends. And this is a weird group in that they had success, at least in the LA scene, fairly early. But all of a sudden, despite the fact that they have this momentum, despite the fact that they have this kind of um, embrace and this kind of cult following, all of a sudden, Hope Sandoval's bandmate Sylvia leaves. It's believed to be a kind of it's believed she went on to be a teacher, wanting to kind of help the kids that she remembered growing up with in high school, middle school, and so forth. And so blue light in some ways functions as kind of a way of seeing your friend off, a way of kind of seeing your friend go on and feeling kind of sad about it, but also kind of accepting that kind of emotional release.
There's a great comparison you make, that image of the blue light in her friend's eyes. You compare it to Jay Gatsby's green light, right, in The Great Gatsby. What makes that parallel meaningful here?
Well, if I could just say one thing too to start is like, I don't know if anyone else does this, but as a kind of reader, as a kind of literary person, like I always want to know what my favorite musicians and artists are reading. And one of the most frustrating things to me is that I never could find out the books David Roback and Hope Sandoval were reading. Like they never wanted to admit it. They get asked constantly in the 90s, who are you listening to? What are you reading? And they don't say. But there's this image in Blue Light that can't be, I think, if you're born in the US, it can't be a coincidence. Hope Sandoval's narrator is looking out at this water. There's movement happening of a boat, and she notices the blue light in both the boat, her friend's eyes. How can that not be so akin to Jay Gatsby looking out of a dock and seeing the green light that represents, depending on what high school teacher you had, the American dream, lost love, romance, ready to bloom again, greed, the death of the American empire, whatever it may be. But here's Hope Sandoval channeling it, I think, again, for that kind of lost romance feeling. In this case, again, to a friend.
I mentioned the interview that I had seen from the mid 90s where Hope talks about a lot of different things, but I think that's the one where maybe she mentions I'm an introvert. But anyway, she talks about the Rolling Stones being an influence, early Rolling Stones. And there's a particular song, Going Home, from 1966 as her favorite. And you point out that there's echoes of Going Home in the track She's My Baby. What's the clearest similarity listeners should listen for?
On one hand, it's the lyrics. I think on one hand, Hope Sandoval is kind of purposely cribbing lyrics from Mick Jagger and Keith Richards here, but she's kind of alternating them, right? It's a person kind of claiming she's my baby, but it doesn't quite feel right. It doesn't quite feel there. But there's also David Roback and Hope Sandoval playing guitar in a way, or playing the music in a way that's so much like that song Going Home. The guitar is literally bouncing along. There's a kind of narration for it too, but it subverts that kind of trend for the Rolling Stones to claim ownership of a woman. Here, it bounces along only for us to learn, right, that she's not really a person's baby, as the song will eventually point out.
There's the overlooked track, Unreflected. She warns against being consumed by the past. What is she cautioning against exactly?
I view Unreflected as kind of a goodbye to the kind of history of early Mazzy Star. For those who don't know, Mazzy Star formed out of the ashes of David Roback's prior band. And Hope Sandoval replaces that band, Opal's lead singer, and they kind of tour for several years under the name of Opal. And there's a kind of punishment to that because, oh my gosh, I finally have a band. I finally have comfort. I finally have musicians I enjoy, that I respect, but I'm singing all these other person's songs. And it takes them a while to break out of it, but I view Unreflected, which comes from that time, as a kind of willingness to kind of forget the past or to cut it off and to think about how important it is to unreflect, to think about the present and to simply kind of accept that and move forward. And that's a kind of valuable lesson, especially when this lead singer is like, losing a friend who wants to be a teacher, when she's kind of forced into the front woman role and not just the songwriter and so forth. And when she's kind of forced to kind of figure out her voice in a band that's starting to rise up.
An accusation often lobbied at Mazzy Star is that the music is too dark, too miserable, right? That's the confrontation and the willingness to engage in the dark sides of life that is present in track like Mary of Silence, but it's also in that next track, Wasted. What do you think people miss when they reduce the band to that label?
I think they miss the fact that, in the word of David Roback's friend, Susanna Hoffs, who's eventually the lead singer of the Bangles, that there is light that pierces through any kind of darkness. David Roback, the guitarist, was always looking in her terms for the rose in the pavement. And there's something about this album in particular, and I make a note of this, and I still believe it's true, that the band is never actually as bright again, right? The other albums are much more dark, much more kind of bleak in a way. But here, whether it's a song like Wasted or we'll eventually get to So Tonight That I Might See, there's light constantly breaking through. And Wasted, which is kind of, again, goes back to that Doors feeling of kind of the boorishness, the kind of drunken, seedy feeling of being in this kind of overcrowded, weird city of LA, contains a momentum to get out of it. It contains the feeling like you're going to be going on. You're not just wasted, actually. You're going to be coming out. You're going to be sobering up to see something eventually beautiful, or what could be beautiful to you.
I got to say, I'm mesmerized by the track Into Dust. That
Mhm.
is a track. Now, I didn't listen to this album until we agreed to do this interview. I only knew of the hit. And so I listened to the whole album and just blown away at how great it is. But that particular track just, I mean, it mesmerized me. As I said, it's followed by the final track, which is the title track you just mentioned. And you describe the shift from Into Dust into the title track as moving from bleakness to something almost like a plea. What's happening emotionally here in that transition between Into Dust into the title track?
Into Dust is like this long sequence of a song, right? It has this poetic, haunting quality in which our kind of Hope Sandoval as narrators kind of issuing this kind of poetic, very poetic set of lyrics out. And I have to say, just before I fully answer your question, Into Dust is weirdly enough like the second most popular song on this album. And I've never fully been able to understand why, other than the fact that it's such an interesting, powerful, mesmerizing song. But it's also kind of used in movies and TV shows in a very kind of interesting way. But it reminds you, I think, when you listen to it, is the way the album flows and the way you move into the title track of the album, how important it is, even for those completely introverted, even for the shy, even for those who only want kind of a few friends, how important a small community is to you. And so we have this track of seeing things like dust, of feeling like you're fading away, only for the album eventually to remind us that other people make you whole. And as we get to So Tonight That I Might See, we begin to see all of a sudden sunshine on a rainy day, just kind of this refrain that closes the album. And I think that's kind of that feeling. It's like you're waking up to a new dawn, or whatever state you're in, right? The sun's going to rise again or something.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. After they broke up in 97, they did reform in 2012. They released their fourth studio album, Seasons of Your Day.
Mhm.
And then sadly, David Roback passed 2020 at the age of 61. He lost a battle with cancers. Hope Sandoval continues to create and collaborate, but is Mazzy Star pretty much done?
It's a weird thing. And I have to say, one of the most unfortunate things about the book is, there are other band members too. They don't play necessarily a central songwriting role, but they were always kind of there on the tour, the few tours they ever did, or kind of in the background. And I have to say, David Roback's passing in some ways, it's like losing part of the soul of the group heavily. But other band members like Keith Mitchell, who's a drummer who did some drum tracks for this album, he passed away too several years before. And so it seems to me, though, that without Keith Mitchell, but especially without David Roback, how can there be Mazzy Star? I view David Roback as essentially a kind of co-narrator. His guitar playing, his piano playing, whatever instrument he hopped on is always the equally, I think, the powerful thing you hear besides Hope Sandoval's voice. And so I think Mazzy Star is kind of a live project, as an alive project may be gone. Now I know, and I think it's been known, that there's a treasure trove maybe out there. We don't know how much music there is. We don't know how much of an archive there is, but maybe one day it will be released. And so if Mazzy Star continues, it's going to be in the form of like a ghost, in other words. Maybe it will happen while Hope's alive. In her words, maybe not, or probably.
When all is said and done, how should Mazzy Star and more specifically this album be remembered?
Such an interesting question, right? It's like I hope people like think about Fade Into You. I hope people think about the other songs, but I think what this song should be remembered for is not just as its canonical place in the dream pop kind of canon or tradition, but I hope people think about it as truly a kind of album about a time and place when you're willing to kind of be alone, as I say in the book, to drift off into the twilight zone, when you're willing to kind of let a kind of powerful, slow, quiet music just consume you. And you're willing to let these kind of shy, introverted narrators essentially tell you a story in a way I don't really think is echoed anymore. I haven't really found something that fills this kind of Mazzy Star hole. There's just something uniquely emotional and powerful in these forces coming together in this album.
So tonight that I might see, it is part of Bloomsbury Publishing's 33 and a third series. And the book is out now. You can get it wherever books are sold. You can also look for it at your nearest independent bookstore. If you have one nearby, you can find out at bookdownrock.com. And can people find you online, Anthony?
I am inspired by Hope Sandoval and David Roback. I am not much online. I have an Instagram out there, easy to find, Anthony Gomez 88. I'm super inactive though, but please follow. If not, my website, anthonygomez3rd.com, anthonygomezii.com.
I like it. How
Updating
apropos.
you, yeah, you're right. Updating you for Mazzy Star, news. Public event, I have to plug it legally, but also personally. May 16th, official LA launch party for this book in Highland Park, not too far from where Hope Sandoval grew up. And that'd be great. Yeah. And I think, one last note, let me just say too, I forgot, if people want to remember or think about this album too, I hope they remember it as an album about LA in a way, chronicling a kind of history that's just unfortunately kind of forgotten, gentrified out, and that just doesn't exist in that city anymore.
And as with every great book that's written about an album or a song or a band, you read the book and you then appreciate that music or that band or that song so much more. And so you did that for me. This is a band again. I knew about Fade Into You, and that was pretty much it. Seeing it on MTV, listening to it on the radio. So to be able to invest in this entire album because of this book, after reading the book, just thank you for a great job on the book.
Yeah, very kind of you. Thank you. And can I just add one thing about the 33 and a third series?
Sure.
I don't know if any of your listeners have ever wanted to write one. If they have, or if they wanted to, everybody knows the funniest thing about the 33 and a third series is every reader thinks they could have written it better. And so it's very kind to get good news, but also like I love seeing the different reactions, positive and negative. People being like, why didn't you say this about Mazzy Star? Why'd you add this about it? It's absolutely exciting. And it's very cool, but you know what? I wrote the book about Mazzy Star I would have wanted to read. I'm glad that you enjoyed it, Eric. So very exciting.
Anthony Gomez III, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it. It's in the books.